This is the first episode of a rebranded, refreshed podcast with me, Sir Ulrich, on the CoinBeast YouTube channel. It's called Eyes on Liberty. This week, I introduce you to Dave Bradley of Bitcoin Brains, entrepreneur and business developer with Bitcoin roots going back to damn near the Genesis block. Today, we're going to talk about government regulation overreach, the Canadian Bitcoin economy and culture, and the issues in the food and drug industry. New logo, new colors, but same me. Enjoy the show.
You find those who have not had freedom and not in a position to define freedom, they're beginning to define it for themselves now. And as they get in a position intellectually to define freedom for themselves, they see that they don't have it. And it makes them less peaceful.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice.
Monetary debasement is out of control. Runaway debt like an animated snowball. The only question is, do you want to take the steps to get out of the way? Or do you become a casualty to parasitic greed? What's up, Dave? How's it going, man? Thanks for joining me on the show.
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. So you're the owner of the brand Bitcoin Brains. Mind going over that with me? Like, what's the name come from? Why did you start it? Of that.
Yeah. So Bitcoin Brains started originally as the brand that we were running what was my first Bitcoin business through. So we launched in 2013 a brick and mortar Bitcoin store, which I think was the first in the world in terms of a store that sold really Bitcoin and everything related in a physical way back then. And we were mostly selling Bitcoin, but we were also selling miners and just about anything else that was related to Bitcoin that existed back then. And we sold that store in 2015, but kept the brand alive as a brokerage where we were buying and selling Bitcoin and just over the counter to our existing customers. And then in 2018, I merged that brand in with Satoshi Portal to form Bull Bitcoin and kind of put that brand on the sidelines. And it was still like my Twitter handle, and it still is my Twitter handle and my handle in most things in the Bitcoin space. But we just brought the brand back recently as the company behind the conference that we run, the Bitcoin Rodeo. And as we recently announced, we have acquired the assets of CoinBeast Media, which includes this YouTube channel. So here we are.
Here we are indeed. So like all different types of arms that are coming together to what this entity is. But going to your website, and I'll probably pull it up when you're talking, but you say you mined your first Bitcoin in 2010. You're a quintessential OG Bitcoiner. It's an honor to be in your presence, sir. But why? What are you doing here with the brand and your venture? Like, what's your vision? Why don't you just kind of ride off in the sunset? It's like, what's your goal with it?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of early Bitcoiners, I was lucky enough to get in early on Bitcoin, but the Bitcoin industry to me is just a totally separate undertaking, I guess, than just buying and owning Bitcoin. And I've been in Bitcoin, involved as a user for 14 years now, and I guess 11 years full time in the industry. So it's the only industry that I've really worked in my adult life, and I don't know what I would do if I wasn't building companies in the Bitcoin space.
Okay, what the hell is this? Dave is very handsome. Dave is an adversarial pain in the arse, but he's also brilliant and an awful lot of fun. And then Elon decided to comment and say, Dave is definitely the strongest and best looking Bitcoin entrepreneur in Canada. I'm glad I'm glad I'm south of the border, sir.
So this is my personal brand website. that used to be the company website. The Elon testimonial is fake, but the other two are real.
Right.
So yeah, I at some point started to claim that I was the strongest and best looking Bitcoin entrepreneur in Canada. And this is an important part of the website too. This is some of my accomplishments, some steaks that I've eaten. And yeah, we had a conference that I was speaking at in, I want to say this was like 2018, maybe 2019. And the now Premier of Alberta, Daniel Smith, who's one of the ones quoted up there, was moderating a panel with Adam O'Brien, my coworker at Bitcoin Brain, or sorry, at Bitcoin-EOL, and the CEO and founder of Bitcoin-EOL, and he was trying to talk some shit about my claims of being the strongest and best looking Bitcoin entrepreneur in Canada. And he said something to the effect of, Dave says he's this, but you can see me right now and you can see him up here later and you can all be the judge. And then Daniel Smith's response, which is a clickable link on the website there, she said, well, Dave is very handsome. And has subsequently gone on to become the premier. And now the quote has a little bit more weight to it.
Right on. So like you have these events. Now you own, let me see if I can pull up that actual one. You own the Bitcoin Rodeo conference. And then you participated or had a major role in the Alberta conference. Now, are those the same?
Yeah.
Those are the exact same thing.
Yeah. So the Bitcoin Rodeo is the conference we've been running here. We first ran it in 2018. We took a few years off and then we ran it again last year and then once again this year. Mm-hmm. You can see this is from this year's the 2024 one that happened about 2 months ago.
Look at this guy right here. What the heck?
And we were gonna, we put on a pretty great show, I think. As you can see, we had a pretty amazing lineup of speakers, and we did a lot of interesting content. My favorite part was the roast of BTC sessions. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that's going on here that's linked on my personal website that we're doing in Calgary here. This is mostly Ben BTC sessions, his baby, but I've been pretty involved in it as well as the Saturday markets, the SAT markets, okay, which are kind of like they're designed to promote the circular economies, and they're basically like a flea market / farmers market where everybody takes sats.
Let me try to pull that one up as well. That's an interesting one. So the Saturday market right here. Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know. This is from a couple markets ago, but this is where we've held most of them. And I mean, we kind of get a bunch of different vendors together, and we had meat and eggs and a bunch of different stuff. And part of the idea and why we wanted to do this was because of this worry that a lot of us have, I think, wherein we're starting to see sort of the trickle in of this. We have this worry that governments of the world are obviously trying to crack down on what we can think, what we can say, and what we can do. And one of those obvious angles that we all kind of see coming is the idea that they're going to try at some point to regulate our consumption and decide what we can spend our money on. And one of the obvious areas that it looks like they're going to be going is to try to attack the idea that we should have a lot of red meat in our diet. So this sort of came about initially from conversations with Ben, where he was like, he was worried about losing the ability to buy red meat. And so obviously, most of us who are in the Bitcoin space, we focus a lot on the number will go up, the store of value, and how that inflation resistance is going to really, in the long term, free us from the tyranny of central banks. But in the short term, as we've seen demonstrated in a lot of places, and really poignantly in Canada here with our trucker protests, is that the government will try to crack down on how we can spend our money, and Bitcoin is a way that we can spend money and use money both as a transactional medium and as a store of value without their help or permission. And so now that we've got this network, and it's great that we've got all these vendors, we've probably had about 50 or 60 different vendors come out to these events, and we're getting a really good turnout. And the biggest advantage, even bigger than the people that come to shop at the markets, I think really is all these different vendors getting to know each other and it all forming a little bit of a community. And now, I can go and buy beef, I can go and buy eggs, and I can buy these things without asking for permission or without going through the officially approved channels. And I think in the long term, that's really important.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, you guys developed this farmers market, this again, a circular economy around this network that we're all so passionate about. And you're sort of moving the needle in a way that very few regions are doing so. And so when I think about moving the needle from a Bitcoin standard perspective, I think about El Salvador, of course, and I think about certain places like Lugano, Switzerland, Nashville. I think a Bitcoin Park, and so now I hear you guys, and of course I've heard this from Ben Sessions as well. How much of Bitcoin culture, like how does Canada's Bitcoin culture stand out from El Salvador's Bitcoin culture? What's the differences? What are the similarities? Because it sounds like you guys are having a very similar impact in changing the way we exchange value.
Yeah, and I mean, so I'll give you a little bit of a story. When we had our store, buying and selling Bitcoin, we were working with a local exchange that used to exist that had a merchant processing platform. And in 2014, we got about 60 merchants in the city of Calgary to start accepting Bitcoin. And just nobody spent any Bitcoin, with the exception of the coffee shop that we had our office in the back of, where they got lots of Bitcoin sales from people coming and going to the Bitcoin office. But other than that, like literally it was just me in the whole city at all 60 merchants. And part of the reason for that is because our payment methods here are actually really good. If you want to go and tap your card, like the user experience of tapping your card is excellent. And if you're holding dollars and Bitcoin, which basically everyone is, which one of those things do you want to part with? Do you want to part with the asset that is dwindling away to nothing, or do you want to part with your hard money? And so there actually isn't a really great reason for businesses to adopt retail Bitcoin payments in North America right now, unless you're in a business where you want to transact outside of the permission of the government. And that increasingly is becoming a larger and larger area of interest, I think, because we're getting to a point where the tentacles of the beast, the government overreach, are getting longer and getting into more aspects of our lives. And the fact is that there isn't a single business that you can start in most of the developed world wherein the first thing that you have to do is something other than overcoming the hurdles the government has put there. No matter what business you want to start, you need a license, you need a permit, and you need to play by their rules. And increasingly, the ability to receive those kind of licenses and permits are becoming more difficult. There are more and more layers of licensing that every business needs to go through. There are more and more layers of bureaucracy that pile on top of every single thing that anyone useful wants to do in the world. And as that mounts, the incentive to use Bitcoin as a payment tool to operate a real business that does useful things for people in exchange for value outside of the government rails grows and grows. And so we can see that like a small example right now is the milk industry, wherein a lot of us in the Bitcoin space have been looking at our food supply as a critical thing that we need to be thinking about and trying to look at exactly what the government has been doing to our food over how many years. And one of the big areas that I've gotten really onto, this is actually, I'm drinking like almost every time I'm on a podcast, I'm drinking a raw milk White Russian. And this is illegal. This is extremely illegal in Canada. This raw milk is legitimately harder to get than cocaine. And it is more illegal from an enforcement perspective to sell milk that is unpasteurized and has not gone through our dairy mafia to the public than it is to sell cocaine in Canada. There's parts of Canada where cocaine is openly legal for sale at retail. You can go to a store in British Columbia and buy cocaine, but raw milk you can't buy anywhere. And even at our SAT markets, we haven't been able to find anybody who's willing to sell raw milk at the market because the chances of getting literally raided by a SWAT team over your sale of milk are quite high. And so these areas where, you know, the government is cracking down to such an extent that we all know it's completely ridiculous. Like the idea that the government has to save us from our milk drinking, which obviously, you know, the drinking of milk from cows is something that's thousands of years old. And the idea that the government is the only one who can safely provide the milk is completely absurd. And when we look at the government provided milk, the pasteurization, the packaging, you know, buying your milk in a plastic container, it's much worse for you than buying regular raw milk from a farmer who's treating the cows properly and feeding them and feeding them grass. And this is an example wherein they've obviously gone too far. And I think they've mostly done a pretty good job of knowing when they're going too far and what line they can push to. But lately, I think they've kind of lost the plot, and they don't realize that there are limits to what people will put up with. And for a long time, people were putting up with these limits because there was simply no other choice. Whereas now that we have this whole parallel financial system, there is another choice, and you can actually buy milk outside of the approved rails, outside of the approved system.
I gotta, there are a couple threads to pull on there, so I have to make sure I should be taking notes, because me from Commie, California, specifically LA, our supply chains are generally pretty solid. And I hear on Bitcoin Twitter that, they talk about the supply chains, they talk about the food. Of course, LA you can buy anything organic. Some people talk about, or you can buy anything no hormones added. The chicken is pretty decent quality. The beef is pretty solid quality. No, I'm never out of fruits and vegetables, even during COVID. But now we talk about, like, I've seen videos where milk is poured down, gallons poured down the drain of whether it's government sponsored or it's the non-government sponsored, unpasteurized milk. I just see it dumped. I've seen cherries by the tons just crushed, destroyed. Blueberries crushed, destroyed. What is this control on the food supply? I just feel like this Kamala Harris price fixing has always kind of been around in the food industry, but it's now just starting to rear its ugly head because of an election, but they were already doing it. What's going on with that? And then we'll talk about the cocaine in British Columbia, because what the hell? But let's talk about that one first.
Yeah. So price fixing is not an untested method. We know what happens when price fixing happens, and it's a pretty direct path to food shortages, right? Because the government, the more they get involved into a supply chain, the more they get involved into anything, the worse it gets, right? Like, when you're talking about the government making decisions for an industry, they inherently don't have the same incentives that anyone in that industry would have, right? Their incentives, in theory, and what the socialists would tell you, is that their incentives are the greater good. Their incentives are to make sure that everything's safe for everyone, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, the socialists that make up the government are just a bunch of people. And those people are just as self-interested as anyone else. And so what ends up happening is that in the short term, they make decisions that ultimately benefit themselves. And in some cases, that is a decision that has to look good to the public. In some cases, that is a decision that has to appease a small, vocal, special interest group. But what you very rarely see are governments making decisions at their own expense that are good for the long-term health of the economy or of society. That's something that's you just don't see that at all in the current world of politics. And so inevitably, the more involved the government gets into any sector of the economy, the more likely they are to cause problems, because all of their thinking is very short term, and it becomes very difficult for them to foresee the longer term consequences of unintended sort of like second order effects and different ways that their actions might adversely affect the economy in the long term. And so the path for price controls to lead to food shortages is really quite simple. It's, your grocery stores are operating on pretty slim margins, and the margins are not the same throughout the store, right? And the sort of shelf stability is also not the same throughout the store. And so the middle of the store, which we all know is kind of like the area we should avoid, it's where you got your processed carbs and trash, basically. All of that stuff is shelf stable for months and also comes with pretty high margins. And the things that we would normally view as staples, you know, the fruit, vegetables, meat, milk, cheese, etc., all around the outside of the store, are not nearly as shelf stable, and the margins are a lot lower. And so the first step when we get price controls is that grocery stores start focusing more on the middle of the aisle stuff and less on the outer aisle stuff. We're also probably going to see every grocery store having to move a little bit more towards products that are not subject to the price controls. And so every like Safeway in the world is going to start to look more like a Walmart. You know, you're going to have clothes and whatever else they can sell that can make the best use of their square footage without cracking down on their margins. And so inevitably what we see is a move more towards Walmarts and a move more towards the large centralization of single retailers who focus on low quality foods that they can sell at the lowest possible margins. And then from there, you know, we're going to see an expansion of this concept that you see throughout the United States, especially of food deserts, where, you know, there are no real, you know, I was in Nashville for the conference there, or for more likely the side events to the conference there, and I was driving around the rural areas of Nashville, and there are huge areas where you can go for like 100 miles without a real grocery store, and all you can go is like the dollar store is the only place that actually has groceries, and the ability to get fresh food is very limited unless you're growing it yourself. And so we'll see an expansion of that. We'll see a centralization of food retailers. And then, you know, inevitably what they're going to have to do as more and more retailers start to go out of business is they're going to say, oh, well, you know, the retailers were gouging, but now it's actually the food suppliers that are gouging. And so we're going to have to put price controls on them. And then the same process will happen with the food resellers. Is again, they'll centralize around their less risky, more processed foods, and you know, the ability to get the you know, produce, meat, etc., is going to be moved and relegated to more like farmers market food, and it will become a luxury. It's going to become the kind of food that most people can't really afford. And you know, it's good to see RFK endorsing Trump, talking about fixing our food supply, fixing the critical health epidemic sweeping, especially the United States, but we have it here in Canada as well. But I think if Kamala Harris gets in and we end up with price controls, this is the path we're going down. And it's not an untested path. It's not rocket science to see where it goes. And it comes down to that same argument of like, you know, real socialism has never been tried. But the fact is, we all know it has been tried. It's been tried many times, and it ends in bread lines every single time. And so that's kind of the choice at hand right now, I think.
This is interesting because, like you say, our food supply. You're Canadian. John, the owner of CoinBeast, Canadian. Everyone we've seen on your conference, Canadians, except for Nico, and I'm obviously Los Angeles. Do you guys feel tied to the U.S. food supply concerns? Are you tied to the U.S. food supply concerns from a dumb United States citizen?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we get a lot of our produce, especially our variety of produce, from the United States and Mexico. You know, we don't have great orange growing climate up here in most of Canada, for example. So,
I had the best orange tree in my backyard in the house I sold in 2018 before I got into Bitcoin. In November, I didn't even water the sucker. I'm like, can I get some oranges? And they're just falling off the tree. It was beautiful. Anyways,
yeah,
continue.
That's amazing. So we have a lot of our produce tied in. We do have our own food supply, but it is not isolated from the U.S. food supply, and it's also not isolated from the same problems as the U.S. food supply. And you know, our leader here, Justin Trudeau, our current leader anyway, who knows how long he'll last, but ideas like this, like price controls, are not far afield, and they're already something that exists in some areas of the Canadian economy, and milk is one of them. You know, we have a straight up mafia. It's a group that blocks anyone else out from participating in the production of dairy, and it is set up in an anti-competitive way to keep the price of milk and dairy products high.
Barriers to entry and lobbyists. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And so Western Canada, we're a little bit better off because we at least have a very robust food supply out here for meat. We have the best beef in the world here in Alberta, and we don't want anyone else's beef imported. But looking at Eastern Canada, you know, if you go to a fancy steakhouse in Toronto or Montreal, some of the best steaks they're going to have on the menu will be USDA prime. And so there is, in fact, a lot of food imported from the United States to Canada, especially those in the East. So we're absolutely not isolated, and I think we have, you know, we have not exactly the same risks, but you're tied in with a lot of the same systemic risks to our food supply for sure.
Right on. So, and you know, you brought up a great point that I haven't even thought about, where it's like, as these price fixes come in, who's going to tell the allegedly, you know, freely operating grocer what they should or should not sell? And if they have, if you know, they're a big box, limited square footage, they're going to sell things that may not be tied to those price constraints. So like you said, t-shirts, you know, basketballs, you know, video games, you know, if people even buy hardware video games anymore, you know, they're going to buy things, they're going to sell things where they can escape these invasive, oppressive laws for the sake of what people say is the greater good, but in actuality, all it does is create bread lines, as you said. So speaking of lines, I want to talk about what you mentioned earlier in British Columbia, cocaine. The snow, if you will, is, you say, sold legally at vendors in that province. Now, I've heard of, you know, really like some very far leftist politicians that want to try to legalize heroin or cocaine in these government approved facilities, and even bring the drugged out people into these government approved facilities where they can get off of their addiction, you know, on our tax dollars. But it seems like, you know, socialist Canada has already stepped up to the plate and pushed that game theory, or pushed that theory to real life. So I want to know, how does that come about, or what's the use case of getting access to this government sponsored cocaine, and what do they deal with? How do they deal with the clear after effects of what happens when it's government sponsored drug use?
Yeah. So first of all, that was a beautiful transition.
That was off the cuff. Speaking of lines, yeah. Oh man, let's make that one a short, okay?
Yeah. So that was great, but yeah. So there is this concept, and I actually would believe in the legalization of drugs being a positive thing. I don't think there's really ever been a government program that accomplished what it set out to do. And in many ways, the legalization, the war on drugs and the illegalization of drugs is what's created, you know, all of the crime around drugs, right? It's created this massive cartel infrastructure that is set up really to provide a product that people want, right? And on top of that, because it's illegal, you know, the process for making cocaine is probably not something that most people would want to take into their bodies, right? It's filtered with gasoline. It's not a really great way to make a product that you're going to put into your body, I think. Whereas the plant itself, you know, you could probably find a way, that the free market could probably find a way to create a product from this plant that could be used in a way that's a lot safer and cleaner. That said, the BC government, British Columbia, has taken kind of like a twisted version of a policy that we've seen in some places in Europe, which is, you know, in a lot of places, they've basically decriminalized drugs, and they've made it so that they've sort of made it into like a gray market where people can get drugs and buy drugs, and it's in general decreased drug usage and increased the safety of the drug supply. But now we've got this other problem going on all throughout North America, which is this fentanyl epidemic. And the fentanyl epidemic is caused straight up by the war on drugs, right? The fentanyl epidemic is a reaction to the price of heroin being as high as it is because of the fact that it's illegal, right? If heroin were legal and people could get it at a store that they could read a Google review on, and they could say, hey, we got some safe and pure heroin at this place, and we tested it and it was as pure as they said it was, and we used it and we enjoyed it, then that's the kind of thing that the market could take care of in terms of keeping the supply safe, right? But because the government has made heroin illegal, the price of heroin is much higher than it would otherwise be. And so there's a great incentive for the organized crime elements who aren't just looking to make a dollar, they're looking to make a dollar however they can, to bring in fentanyl, which is basically a much easier to transport due to its size. It's much, much stronger. And so they can bring in a lot more of it per weight. And it's much cheaper, you know, and it's coming, I believe, from China with the state-sponsored idea that they want drugs in North America. I think the communists are straight up sending these drugs to North America as a direct attack. Yeah, it's a direct attack on our society, and it's killing untold numbers of people, unbelievable numbers of people all throughout North America. And so the response to this from the BC government, rather than backing off on the policy that caused this in the first place, is to try to double down and say, okay, we're going to not only legalize drugs, but we're going to do that in sort of a government sandbox. And so government approved retailers can now sell certain drugs within the province of BC. And there's sort of like a window for this that's an experiment that I think is going to end at some point. But it's pretty wild there now. There's a store that I saw when I was there earlier in the year, and it's right down in the really bad part of Vancouver, East Hastings. And it's literally got a sign that's like cocaine, opiates, LSD, peyote. This is what the storefront says, and this is what they're selling. So you can walk right in there and buy any of these things. And now, because the government can never really anticipate second order effects, like you asked about, you know, what are the obvious things that come out of that? The fact is right now that most of the junkies down there don't really want heroin anymore, because they've now been addicted to fentanyl, which is much stronger. So they actually want the fentanyl tinted drugs at this point. And so what they're doing is they're going in, they're getting under as many identities as they can, because they don't really check identities of the homeless. You know, they don't really have a way to do that. So they're in some cases prescribing the same thing many times to different people. They're going and getting government approved heroin from all of these safe supply places in BC. And then they're trading it for the stronger fentanyl. And now the drug dealers are basically getting a large supply of heroin basically for free. And so there have been cases where, you know, large scale drug dealers in British Columbia have been caught with like thousands of doses of safe supply heroin that now are being used really as like a gateway and an entry drug to get new users in to the opioid addiction in the first place. And so just like everything else, the government couldn't foresee a pretty simple second order effect. And now the intended policy is having pretty much the exact opposite effect that they are going for.
So, you know, I hear this, and you know, it's funny because from a property rights standpoint, you know, your body, you know, you get to kind of direct what goes into your body, whether it's a vaccine or an injection of heroin or cocaine. And that's, you're not the law breaking happens where you break the law to appease that addiction. When you are stealing because you are addicted to heroin or fentanyl or cocaine in order to acquire more of it, that's where you break the law, and that's where you're punished. So my question is, if all these drugs are theoretically within the bounds of our first principle rights. Then we have this fentanyl that comes in that is extremely dangerous, but it's been in the market and people are using it. And of course, it's high lethality. Is that not too bounded by our first principles as well? Where does the line draw? Those are the kind of things where it's like I understand the weed, and then at some point becomes this gray area where, okay, it starts to become lethal. Where does the governing forces come in and protect its people from themselves potentially, or from outside people that want to supply it? Where does the line draw?
Yeah, 100%. I very much agree with the rights of everyone to do whatever drugs they want. I don't think, as long as they're not committing property crimes or violent crimes or theft or anything else like that to be able to fund those addictions, then I don't think that the state or anyone else has any right to say what someone can put in their body, whether that's, like you said, a vaccine or heroin. Now, what's going on right now is you've actually got, from several different directions, you've got the government twisting everyone's incentives, right? And so in the first place, a lot of the reason that you have that property crime and the need for people to break into cars and steal car stereos to buy their heroin is because of the artificially expensive nature of heroin, right? If it wasn't so artificially expensive because it was illegal, then it wouldn't be necessary to do that, right? Realistically, it's a pretty inexpensive thing that just comes from a plant. And people could probably afford to waste their lives on heroin if that's what they want to do, for a lot less money if it was just operating like a normal business and within those same supply chains. And then, like I mentioned, the safety of the drugs is severely impacted by the legality as well. And I don't mean that the government should be regulating it to make it safe. That's certainly the path that I think we'll see at some point. That's what we see with weed, in Canada and most of the US, is that the government's regulating it. And the fact is that it's gotten worse and less safe and a lot more expensive. And the business side of it has become a lot less clear compared to what it used to be. And I see that happening with virtually every drug. I have a lot of faith in the power of the free market. And I do believe that if the market was able to act on these drugs, that not only would they settle on some reasonable prices, but like I mentioned before, you'd probably have a really good system that would emerge through the markets for keeping the drug supply safe. Because if a store was selling tainted cocaine, there'd be a pretty high incentive for people not to want to buy the cocaine there, right? And that would, just like anything else, like if a restaurant started killing people with poisoned food, that'd probably make it into the Google reviews, and then they wouldn't do so well, right? And so that's the second way that the governments are kind of getting in the way. And then, the third way is through that safe supply, where they're really just they're twisting the incentives again. And so now, for the users, the incentive is not to use market provided safe drugs. The incentive is to use the incentive basically is to break into cars and buy the fentanyl at this point. And then on top of that, we've got the mechanisms of government that are supposed to be the core of the services that they provide, namely the protection of physical safety and property rights, that in many cases, California is a prime example, they're just not doing that at all. Most of the cities in North America, they're pretty much abandoning the protection of property rights, and physical safety protections are becoming a lot more limited. And they've set up this sort of bubble around these users where their incentive is nothing more than to continue what they're doing. If you're a drug user on the streets of a major city, you're going to have free food, you're going to have free shelter, you're going to have somebody out there Narcaning you if you overdose. And if you break into cars, if you become a public nuisance, if you steal, if you rob to be able to fund that addiction, there isn't really going to be a negative consequence to any of those things, because the police are more interested in writing traffic tickets and cracking down on protesters than realistically the core of what they're supposed to be doing. And so you've got this sort of perfect storm around these people where, in the name of protecting them and in the name of protecting society, the government has made a series of decisions that all lead to exactly the opposite result of what they should be trying to do. And now we've got essentially these zombies patrolling our cities that are on crack and heroin and fentanyl and everything else, who don't have an incentive to conform to the norms of society. They have no reason to want to pull themselves out of the situation that they're in. And they have no reason to want to keep us safe. There's no reason for them not to rob or assault people, for that matter. And so that, I think, is what it comes down to. And it's sort of the same thing. You could make a case for this in virtually every area of the economy. The government has surrounded everything with useless policies that do nothing but make things worse.
Oh man, I was just in downtown LA yesterday. Went to go see a play, Clue. It was funny. It wasn't woke either. It's surprising, and it's just walking from there to a restaurant with my wife, and I'm just like, I got my Bitcoin gold pendant, and I'm sticking in my shirt, and I'm walking with my fists clenched because like I'm just and no one's even close to me, but you can just feel like 50 feet away or 50 yards away is this one guy. You see him acting weird, and then you turn the corner and there's another guy, and then another woman is walking really fast and she's pacing for a quarter mile, like in the same pace as you, and you're just like, this truly is a zombie land. And I live in Los Angeles, but I don't live in the city proper. I live closer to the beach where the Redondo Beach, where the suburbs are, and it's just different. And these urban zones are dying, and they're dying fast. And it's these policies and these policy makers that, whether they think that they're doing good or it's truly nefarious activities, they're all screwed up, and they're not making anything better, not one of them. And so, when it comes down to policy and regulators, I kind of want to context switch a little bit, go down a different path. You being Canadian, us Americans, especially people from the big cities that say, oh, like, this is all we know is our America. A lot of especially Bitcoin culture, it's not as known other places. We know El Salvador. I'm learning about Canada ever more so, especially working with you and John. Quadriga was an exchange that had a volatile history, and it was actually based in British Columbia as well. You being an OG Bitcoiner, again, mining back in 2010, what were your memories of that exchange? What were your memories of the events that took place there? And were you impacted at all?
Yeah, I mean, I was very adjacent to that. So when we had our store in 2014, so back in these days, there was no regulation on Bitcoin. There was no there was no ability to register as a money service business like we all are now, which provides a little bit of a framework in terms of how we're supposed to be operating. So back then, we were buying more Bitcoins than we were selling in 2014. This is a bear market. And so we had the need to convert, when we were buying coins, we had the need to convert them back to Canadian dollars and then pay out those Canadian dollars. And so we were using a few different exchanges throughout Canada, and Quadriga was one of them. And at one point, they started to kind of struggle with their payouts. And so they started sending us checks. And the checks we got several checks that were all check number 1 from a new numbered company. And we're like, this is not good. Like, this is an obvious attempt to obscure the source of funds or something like that. We don't know what's going on there, but we're gonna stop dealing with these guys now, because it was a shady looking business practice. And then sometime later, we all kind of found out that there was a link between the founder of Quadriga and this convicted money launderer that had been working for a credit card fraud ring in the US by the name of Omar Dhanani. And this kind of became an open secret within the Bitcoin industry that kind of made the rounds of the Bitcoin industry. I know for certain that a number of law enforcement agencies were contacted with this information. They had this information in 2016 at least. And this was as a result of this information getting out, they were kind of blacklisted from some payment processors, and they were in the process of trying to go public, and this kind of killed that idea. And then this guy, Mike, who was somebody that I had met a few times, his name was Mike Patron, was one of the founders of Quadriga, basically just disappeared after it came out that he was actually Omar Dhanani. And it was the other guy running the company, which was Gerald Cotton, Jerry. And Jerry was a young guy. He was a little bit weird. He was a little autistic, but seemed like a pretty good guy. And I had dinner with him a couple times, met him a number of occasions, and didn't really get very deep into their business, because after we stopped using them because the shadiness with their checks, we weren't really exposed to whatever they were doing. But there was definitely this general feeling like once the Omar Dhanani stuff came out and they were having a lot of banking difficulties, like I kind of felt like from that 2015, 2016 on, I was surprised that they hadn't collapsed yet. It was like they had another 2 weeks to live at all times. And when we heard about them actually collapsing, I think it was late 2018. It was not a surprise, but then of course all the details that came out thereafter were pretty surprising. The fact that Jerry had died in India, and that he had died from a complications of celiac disease. And like I mentioned, I had dinner with him a few times, and he never mentioned anything about being a celiac. So it's possible that he just didn't mention it, and I didn't notice that he was just ordering gluten-free stuff. But it certainly doesn't seem to me like, if you do have an inflammatory bowel disease, that going to India doesn't seem like a good idea.
That's so crazy. I mean, and you talking about that right now, just relive, I did a review on that documentary when I was working with SWAN. And, normally I'm just not the documentary type. And especially about Bitcoin, I don't watch any Bitcoin documentaries. I like to read, and I like to listen to a few podcasts, but primarily get my information from Twitter. But that show had me, I was on the edge of my seat, wait, what happened? And then it's you recalling all of that, brought back all this, these stunning moments. And maybe it's just Netflix knowing how to tell a story, but everything you said was oh, I remember that. I remember that. It's so interesting.
Yeah, and I watched the documentary, and I don't remember it that well, but I remember thinking it was pretty good. It wasn't a lot of the time when you have sort of a front row seat to things, they end up missing a lot, and I don't think they missed very much. They definitely didn't get anything major glaringly wrong, and they didn't really miss much that at least the stuff that was publicly known.
Right on. Okay, so I want to go back to your association with Bull Bitcoin and then talk about Bitcoin well. And so you co-founded Bull Bitcoin with Francis, right?
Yep.
Okay, and now you're on in 2020 you joined the Bitcoin well with O'Brien. And so I want you to talk to me about your role with Bull Bitcoin, bringing that about, and then what caused you to transition to the Bitcoin well. And these are, again, I have no clue. Again, Canada stuff. Sometimes I jokingly call you Canada. I don't know if anyone thinks that's funny. I think it's funny, but I am completely a novice into all the nuances of Bitcoin in Canada, except for the Quadriga thing, because I watched the damn documentary. So, pardon my lack of knowledge. So why don't you tell me about the story between those two essentially exchanges that you were involved in.
Yeah, so they're not really exchanges. They're both more like brokerages.
Brokerage, I'm sorry, term. Yeah,
but they're very, very, very similar. Yeah, there's no order books on either one. So Bull Bitcoin was formed out of the idea that Francis and I wanted to create a Bitcoin super company for Canada. And we essentially wanted to sort of unite behind the ideals of Bitcoin maximalism and just create what it is today, which I think is, it's really the best Bitcoin platform in the world. It's definitely the most advanced from a technical perspective, and it's, for the hardcore user, the best place you can buy Bitcoin anywhere in the world is Bull Bitcoin. And it's too bad for you guys that you will probably not ever get Bull Bitcoin in the US, or if you do, it'll be a tough road to get there because the regulatory.
I'll just say before to cut you off, from what I've heard about Bull Bitcoin, I am chomping at the bit to wish, do I need a house just to, 50% time just to buy from there? It's a great product. Continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so, so we formed that that company, like I said, in 2018, which is the combination of our two brokerages. And yeah, I mean, I was mostly working while I was actually working there on kind of like the business development side, and whereas Francis was a lot more like head down in the product. And at a certain point, we had gotten to the point where there was more stuff that we wanted to do that we were just realistically not going to be able to do for a very long time. And this one idea that I really wanted to do is essentially the biggest thing that I left to do, and that was creating some software for the Bitcoin ATMs, which is an industry that I had been in originally when we had our store. You know, we launched the first Bitcoin ATM in Calgary here, which is I think one of the top, like maybe the first like 15 in the world. And so it's an area that I have some history with. And then what ended up happening was I was starting this company to make the software for the Bitcoin ATMs, and ended up talking to Adam, who was also running Bitcoin ATMs, as a potential client. And he was like, yeah, I want to do that also. And so originally what we teamed up on was the company called Ghost Lab, making software for the Bitcoin ATMs. And then what that led to was him being like, hey, I want to take the company public, and can you help me with this? And I was like, well, I've never done that, but I could probably figure it out. And so I ended up joining as a consultant initially with BitcoinWell to help take the company public. And then as a result of that, we ended up rolling the software company Ghost Lab into BitcoinWell. So that got my involvement to be a little bit more serious there. And I joined as a full-time executive for a couple of years. And I was, and I'm still on the board there. And yeah, we went through the whole process of taking it public and learned a lot through that. And now it was the first Bitcoin ATM company in the world to go public, and still public now on the Canadian TSX Venture Exchange.
That's awesome. And, you know, I hope you all do well. I bought myself a few shares on the OTCs. So I definitely wish you well. It's amazing how many outlets that you have in the Bitcoin space, from conferences to ATMs to brokerages, to, you know, marketing platforms and education platforms like my own podcast. I would say I have one more question. With this platform, the Bitcoin CoinBeast, what's your intent with CoinBeast?
Yeah, so it kind of came about with, you know, I had this idea that I wanted to do something similar to what the website CoinBeast.com is. And the reason for that was because, you know, being with a bunch of these different companies for a while, I've been the one that people were trying to sell advertising and sponsorship to for a long time. And I've been largely not happy with the lack of a connection between what the advertising or sponsorship was doing and the actual intended goals for the business. And so, you know, the business wants to sell more Bitcoins. The business wants more users. And the reality is that a lot of those sponsorship deals and a lot of those different advertising avenues end up being a lot more like bus bench ads for realtors, wherein, you know, maybe you get your brand in front of somebody 15 times and then they decide to make a purchase. Maybe that has an impact, but it wasn't really that direct. And so at the same time, there's all these websites out there, you know, buy Bitcoin worldwide and 99 Bitcoins. And there's a bunch of these that are really kind of like clickbaity sort of traffic funnel sites that are really quite low quality, but they actually do a very good job of converting the search traffic into actual users that buy Bitcoin. And so my idea was to kind of marry those two things and say, you know, we can do a website with very high quality content, but still actually use those sort of clickbaity techniques, those, you know, top 10 lists and things that people want to read for a short period of time, or things that will actually help people make a directed purchasing decision. And so that's something that we've seen in a lot of different other industries. You know, if you Google like almost any product and you say like, I want the top 10 like rotary shavers for 2014, there'll be like 100 lists, and they're all like pretty decent. You know, they give you some info, and that kind of thing didn't really exist for Bitcoin. It doesn't really exist for Bitcoin. And so that was kind of primarily where my idea came from, was that I wanted to make these kind of high quality traffic funnels intended to drive business to Bitcoin companies. And then when we found CoinBeast, which we found through a friend of mine and my co-organizer in the Bitcoin Rodeo and a business partner of mine, Amanda, who knew John and the other owners of CoinBeast, and found that what they were doing was quite similar, but they didn't really have the time or the drive to turn it into anything bigger than it was. And so once we started talking about it, we were able to come up with a pretty good acquisition where we acquired those assets. And the YouTube channel was actually kind of just like a nice bonus that there was a good YouTube channel. And, there had been a previous show on there, and then your show had taken over. And I wasn't really familiar with your show before I saw it. And I was like, oh, this is actually a good show. So we've got the channel and we've got the show. And then hopefully a bunch of the viewers have seen, we've recently launched another show with Heather, who will hopefully be on here soon, and you'll hopefully be on her show soon, called Unhypnotized. And so we've got the two shows running at the same time on the channel. And I think the broader goal with the channel is to sort of expand the scope of what people are discussing, because there has been this just a million different sort of interview shows where you get somebody on there and it's like, let's talk about how much we love Bitcoin, and you see kind of the same you see kind of the same interview show happen again and again and again, the same guests on everyone's show, and they have roughly the same conversations. And I think that that model is running out of legs a little bit, and people are looking for more interesting, in-depth conversations that are a little bit more human, that are linking both the people that they're talking about the people in the industry, as well as what it means to be in the industry, what it means to use Bitcoin, and how the concept of hard money actually affects our lives. And that's kind of the stuff that I want to get into, both on the website as well as the YouTube channel, is to talk about in a way that's not just interesting to those of us who are already sold on the idea of Bitcoin. A big group that I want to go after that's very big here in Alberta is the freedom community. All the people that were woken up by the government overreach of COVID, which is a large and growing group. The people who have identified the problem that we all face, which is basically the drastic expansion and overreach of the government and their theft and spending of as much value as they can possibly get their hands on. And all of these people have identified that problem in different ways. And now I think they're sort of in a spot where they're ready to hear the solution, or at least what we think is the solution, which is obviously Bitcoin. And so the goal is to create a bunch of different media properties with the different shows on the YouTube channel, the conferences that we run. We run a bunch of smaller events, as well as the website, that can be useful and interesting to Bitcoiners, but also attract that larger audience that I would describe as the potential new future Bitcoiners, the people that are going to be coming in next. That's who we most want to be talking to, I think.
A brilliant summary and a great conclusion to the show. David, sipping on that raw milk, man. That's why you got that beef on you, bro. I love it. Thank you for coming on the show. It was great to catch up with you and to talk about your vision, to talk about the history. Your roots run deep in Bitcoin, and I'm only hoping to get to that point one day myself, and I'm sure many of the guests as well. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me.
So that was Dave Bradley, Bitcoin Brains, the owner of this podcast of many different, he's had many different experiences with so many different stories in Canada, across the world with Bitcoin. A great way to start off Eyes of Liberty, episode 1, the second season of my podcast. And I hope to have many more episodes under this label as well. I'm Sir Ulrich, like my father before me. Tune in next week when we have another brilliant Bitcoin guest.